What up, guys? What up, guys? I am Lou, and got another video, guys. Another video. This is from a request from a viewer, and ultimately, guys, we're going to be talking about how do we download a file, let's say from SharePoint. In this case, it's going to be SharePoint, but this really applies to any other source. Doesn't matter. Download a file from SharePoint. We're going to save this in memory. We're going to modify the file, and in my case I'm going to use pandas to modify the file. After I finish modifying the file, then I'm going to go ahead and take that updated version and save it back to SharePoint. So all we're doing is pulling the file that we want, we're going to modify it and then push it back. And not everything's being done in memory as well, so it's not like we're downloading it, saving it locally, then we got to read it, put it in memory to modify, and then we save it locally, then upload it again. We're not doing all that. So this method would be very ideal, especially if you're going to publish this code in a AWS Lambda or Azure Functions or things of that nature, right? So, but guys, but before we get started, hit that like button, give me a follow. Give me a follow as well, guys, on Twitch. So I've been putting some effort on Twitch. That channel, I'm going to be talking more hardware related tech. So in this channel, programming. On my Twitch channel, will be more hardware. I'm going to be reviewing 2 mechanical keyboards this Friday. I'm reviewing different stuff: headsets, mouses, keyboards, GPUs, motherboards. The list goes on, right? So I'm very hardware more specific. But go ahead and give me a follow there, man. I appreciate it. Let's get started. All right, guys. So one of the things that so we're not going to start from scratch, right? Because I already got code that's going to do a majority of what we're trying to do. So there's no need to start over from scratch. So I'm going to be using this Office 365 API file that I put together. You could access this through my GitHub account. So go ahead and find I am Lou coding, and there's a repo called Python SharePoint Office 365 API. So if you take a look at it, you'll pretty much this is what I have. You can just copy and paste this. If you need help on how this should be configured, your environment variables, go ahead and look at the video. Here's the video right here. If you go to my channel, I am Lou, there is a video that is called Python Download SharePoint Files Part 1. Okay, so I have a multi-part series. You can tell I got part 2, part 3 of other stuff, but this one is downloading files from SharePoint Part 1. This part goes very detailed when it comes to the environment variables, how to configure, kind of how to get that configured, how does the site URL looks compared to like my site, the site name, all of this stuff, right? It goes very detailed. So take a look at that, guys, if you're not familiar with it, and that video will kind of give you some guidance over that piece. Nevertheless, if you are familiar with all of that, then just literally copy and paste this in your project. This is what we're going to be using. Then of course I'm going to have another file. This is where I'm going to be downloading. I just call it download and re-upload. So we're downloading, we're going to modify it, then we're going to literally push it back. That's what we're doing here, right? So for this, if I go back to my my repo, I have, if you go to the project under examples, click on download files. Pretty much I'm going to take this, but I'm going to tweak it. Right now, there's a lot of stuff in here that I need because it's exactly what I want to do. Right, so let me go ahead and copy it. But I'm not going to use it as is. As you could tell, if you take a look at this, it is saving it. I don't want to save it, right? Like, we don't want to save it nowhere. As we downloaded, we want to keep it in memory and then do whatever we need to do with it and then push it back. So there's no need to save it anywhere. As you could tell, I have arguments here where it says argument 2 is pretty much doing a local remote folder destination. Well, this is where I want to save it locally, or I'm not saving it locally, so this could actually go away. Right, so now we have for arg2, then arg3. So I do need to change my values to argument 2 and argument 3. So these I do want, right? As you could tell, first argument is SharePoint. I got to specify the SharePoint pass. So here's one of my examples, YouTube 2022. And then of course I have file name. This could be set to none. Or you could provide if you want a specific file that you want to download, right? You don't want to download all the files, maybe you just want one file. So in our case, we're actually going to use this because we just want to process one file specifically. And then of course you have patterns. You know, if you are, let's say if you're not going to download one file, but you're looking at a folder of mini files and you're trying to access a specific pattern, you could do it that way as well. And it will give you the list of files of the pattern. But again, we're going to focus on one file in our case. We don't need the save function because we're not saving nothing. This is going to go away. You can tell we have, you know, error here, but we'll fix that. But ultimately, this is going to go away because we're not going to save it nowhere, right? And all of this could stay. This could stay. This is all normal. So all of this could stay, right? These are just some tweaks that we're making. There's a few things that we're going to have to bring in. So in my case, I'm going to be modifying the goal here that I'm going to do is I want to download an Excel file specifically from SharePoint. So because I'm doing it, and I'm going to put it into a data frame, right? Pandas data frame. So because of that, make sure to install Pandas. I already have it installed in my virtual environment. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring that in. So I'm going to call this import pandas as PD. All right, so that's number one. Another thing I need to bring in here that this you know, the code that I copied doesn't have, I'm going to use the IO package, and there is a bytes IO class that I'm going to be utilizing. And ultimately, that's where as I bring in my content, I'm going to put that. I'm going to end up packaging that into in memory, and to do that, use bytes IO class. So that's kind of what I'm going to be doing here. And I believe this is it, guys. I believe this is it. Well, I don't need the pure pass because I'm not reading nothing, right? I'm not reading no local directories or whatever. So that could go away. This is it. So now let's go ahead and let's add what we need, right? That's the other thing. Now we need what are we going to add? So the first thing that I'm going to do is, since we know we want to get files, well, we have a function already here where, again, because we downloaded it from the download.py file. So there's a function here to get files, and you could tell it's calling the SharePoint class, which is up here, and then it's calling the download files function, and then ultimately it's able to download it, right? And I'm get back my file object. So that's all good. That's going to stay. But I do need to upload files, right? As I download files, I'm going to be modifying it, then I'm going to be uploading them back. So let's go ahead and create that class right quick. And we're going to call this upload file. That's what I'm going to call it, right? Upload file. So in this case, this is going to take a few arguments. It's going to be file name. So this is the actual textual file name, whether it be sales report dot xy sx, right? Is the Excel file extension, because I'm dealing with files. If you're dealing with CSV, it'll be, you know, sales report dot CSV. You know, whatever that name is, that's what we're going to have here with the file extension as well. The next thing that we're going to specify is going to be the folder name. Well, the folder name is where do we want to upload it to, right? In our case, we're going to upload it to the same folder, but it doesn't have to be. Like, we could specify a whole different folder to upload it to, but again, in our case, same folder. And then the final thing is going to be the context. This is going to be the actual data, like the file data itself that we're pushing on over. And since this SharePoint class that I have here, I already have a function for uploading, which is called upload files. I'm going to end up calling that function. So in this case, it would be SharePoint, SharePoint upload file. You could do it in chunks, but in our case, we're going to stick with just upload file, like the whole file all at once. Then I'm going to specify file name. All right, and then folder name, and then the context. It just happened to be that these are the same name. Well, yeah, no context. So if we take a look at this function, you could tell we have file name, folder name, context. Happen to be the same name. It's a coincidence, but it doesn't matter that they're the same name because I'm passing them in the same placement, right? So even if this was called new file name, folder only, or maybe data, again, it's in the right placement. So that's all that matters. Really, this is it though, guys. This is all I need to pass here. This function will upload files back to where they need to go, which is pretty easy, right? Again, taking out what we already have, we're just doing some tweaks to it. That would get the data back to SharePoint. So we have this function to download a file from SharePoint. We have the file here to upload the file back to SharePoint. So now what we need to do is we need to create a function to, let me make it a bit bigger because I think it's kind of small. There it goes. So now what we need to do is create another function, and this function is going to be more so to modify the file, right? Do something with the file. There's some kind of manipulation that we're going to do to it. So for now, I'm going to call it modify file. And this would be whatever action you're doing, right? If you're downloading a file, maybe you're doing some sort of cross-reference of some sort where you're iterating over the data by email, and maybe you're cross-referencing that email by another data set to retrieve back some kind of identifier, and then maybe you're going to add the identifier to a new column. I mean, the list goes on of what you could do with it. Where you're going to do something basic to kind of give you the concept and the idea. So in this case, we're only going to have one argument, which is file object. So again, if I go back, see where we get our get file, we get back this file object. Well, this file object is going to get passed into this function, which is called modify file. That's pretty much what we're doing here, right? So this is where, as we get back that context from SharePoint, this is where I'm going to now utilize my bytes.io class, and I'm going to end up passing in this file object. So by me passing it to this class, ultimately what it's doing is now I have this data set, this data object that I could read now. Like I could pass this in through OpenPyXL if I want to like read it through that package. In my case, I'm going to read it through Pandas, which is ultimately using OpenPyXL. So keep in mind, if you're doing something like what I'm doing, like with Pandas and reading Excel files, that is a package that you're going to have to install as well. So if you're not familiar with OpenPyXL, you know, that is a package that you're going to have to install. But that's kind of what I'm doing here first. So once I do that, then what I'm going to end up doing is, before I even read the data, I want to be able to get a list of worksheets in the file, right? So this is the key. I'm going to call this worksheet list, and this is going to call my Panda. And there is an Excel file class, which ultimately takes in a data set. Like takes in an object, pretty much. In this case, it could be the file directory path. Like if you're working locally, it'll be your C drive, you know, your folder name, then your file name, right? Your full path pointing to your folder, your file. And ultimately, this will read that file. In our case, we're dealing with an actual object, that we're going to read it. We're pretty much dealing with in-memory object. So it's going to react the same way, though. It's going to read it no different if it was reading it locally. And then we're going to call sheet's name. So sheet's name is going to ultimately give me back all the sheets in the workbook in a list, which is why I call this worksheet list. So if you have an Excel file that has, I don't know, maybe 10 sheets, but you only want to modify one of them, then you're going to have to specify which one you're going to modify. In our case, we're only dealing with a workbook with one sheet, right? So just kind of FYI. I'm going to make another video later on how to handle workbooks with many worksheets that you're only going to modify one because it's slightly different. But I'm not going to do it in this video. That's a whole different video. All right, so once I specify to be able to get my worksheets list, now what I could do is I could go ahead and read my my in-memory data into a data frame. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to call this data frame, and it will be panda read Excel. And then see where we have our IO file pass or buffer bytes. Again, it takes one or the other. It takes a file pass slash bytes, which is ultimately what we're doing here. In my case, it's going to be we're passing a bytes object, which I call data. So I'm passing that in. One of the other arguments, see where it says sheet name, right? So for sheet name, I'm going to call my worksheet list index 0. I only have one sheet in here, so I'm specifying the first sheet. So for me, I could just leave this blank and that will be fine because by default, it's going to read only the first worksheet anyways, right? But let's say you didn't want the first sheet. Maybe you wanted sheet number 2. That you want to specify maybe index number 1, right? Because again, index 0 is really the first sheet and then 1 is the second sheet. You would have to do that. So I'm just doing it more from just kind of give an example if you wanted to pull other sheets. So this is going to read the first sheet, put the information into a data frame, which is exactly what we want. Do some. Then in here, I'm gonna call this apply apply changes. So this is where I'm gonna do something to it, right? I'm gonna be changing something. So in my case, I'm going to create a new column. I'm just gonna literally call this new column for testing, so we can see what it is. And then I'm gonna call this testing new column. That's all, something basic. Again, in your case, this would be completely different, right? Maybe you're adding 2 columns together, you're getting a total. Maybe doing some logic based on if it's greater than 30, you know, change the value to this or whatever, right? The list, maybe you want to iterate and change all of your values to uppercase values instead of lowercase values. I mean, again, the list goes on to what you're trying to do, but you're trying to give the concept. So once I do that, something simple, right? Nothing crazy. We're just doing a basic change. So the next step is this step will now create the Excel object in, damn it, man, I don't know, cannot spell today, in memory. So now we're going to be, the next step is pretty much what, as we make changes, as you could tell what we did so far, we read from a SharePoint site, we have our context, we pretty much package this context now into a bytes object, and then we're now able to read it into a data frame. Now we modify the data frame. Well, now we want to take that data frame and now we want to save it back. But before we save it, we can't just save it directly to SharePoint. You know, the way, like normally to save it, you would just do like a save and specify a local directory and it would just save there. And that's, you know, so straightforward. But now we want to save back to SharePoint. So it's not that straightforward. What we're going to have to do here is now we're going to have to create, because again, think about it, we have a data frame object. We need to create that data frame object into an Excel in-memory object because we need it in memory, right? We want it to be saved in memory, not locally. And once we do that, then we could take that object and now push it back to SharePoint, right? So that's kind of what we're doing here. So in order to do that, I'm going to create this. This is going to be called output object. That's what I'm going to call it. And now I'm going back to my IO. So IO bytes, and in this case, it's gonna be blank. So this is just I'm creating output object that's empty. There's nothing in it, right? That's all I'm doing. It's empty for now. All right, so that's number one. In Panda, there's something what's called Excel Writer, right? So we're going to be calling that class. And ultimately, this is to create Excel objects is what we're ultimately doing here. So we have a in-memory object to begin with, and now we're going to be creating an Excel object. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to call this writer, and this is going to call PW Excel Writer. And I'm going to, see where you can specify your pass, whatever, but in my case I'm specifying a bytes object, and that's what I'm going to be specifying in here, which is called output object. Okay, so now that we have that done, the next thing is we're going to now write to, or we're going to export out our data frame. So the way you would normally do it in any scenario, right, if you're going to do it locally, it would be like to Excel. And then see where it says it will be to Excel, and you kind of specify your pass, and ultimately that's pretty much it, right? You know, you're done. But in this case, it's not. We're not writing it to some sort of directory pass. We're writing it to our Excel writer, which ultimately our Excel writer object happens to be an in-memory object. So I mean, hopefully it's not too confusing, but just let's walk through it, right? The next thing is, see where I'm gonna call, it's called index. Oops. Index 0. So this is key. If you don't specify index 0, what that means is it's going to add a column, and that column that it adds is going to be to show like the sequential index of all of your rows. So I'll show you an example. Well, I guess I'll show you. Let's say you have a worksheet that you have first column is name, second column is phone number, and then it's age. Well, if you don't put index 0, when it export it out, you're gonna have those three columns, but the very first column though in your Excel export, it's not gonna be name. It's going to be index, and it's going to show a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pretty much listing them. But an actual, it's taken up, which is going to be placed in column A in Excel. So if that's something that you want, by all means, you could leave it there. Like, it will give you that. Most people, I'm going to assume, don't want that. So this is where you specify index 0 to remove that, get that removed. So the next thing too is sheet's name. If you leave it blank, what happens is it'll export it out and save it, but it's going to save it as default, which is sheet 1. Well, in our case, we want to save it back to the same name that we got it, right? Again, maybe you don't, but if you do, this is where I'm going to have to now call my worksheet list index 0. So again, this worksheet list is going to give me back a list of worksheet names. The worksheet that we're going to be dealing with only has one name anyways, right? So there's only one name. But nevertheless, that same name, whatever that name happens to be, I want it to, whenever we save it, you know, to Excel, I want it to have the same sheet name. If that's what you want, then this is what we would do. If you do not want that, you could just remove it, leave it blank, and the default will be sheet 1. So just kind of keep that in mind. And once we do that, next I'm going to do will be writer save. I'm going to save the changes, and then it's going to be output seek 0. So this is what we're going to specify, seek 0 for our bytes object. And this is it. So this is it. What we just did right now, we have this output object, and that object, which is in memory, now think of it as it has our Excel file in there with the same worksheet name, with all of the data and all that stuff. It has everything in there. So now we could go ahead and use that object output object to push back to SharePoint ultimately, right? So now see how we have this function which we call upload file. So now I'm going to end up calling that upload file, And then again, it wants a file name. In my case, I'm going to create, I want it to be a unique file name for testing. So I'm going to call it, I don't know, let's call it what? Testing modify Excel file, then the file extension. Because this is what we're testing out. So I'm just, again, calling it that. If it's going to be the same name that you had, you could do that as well. But I'm just calling it something different so you kind of see the two, right? Then the next thing is going to be folder. I wanted to save it under the same folder that we pulled the file from. If you want it to go into a different folder, then you got to specify where in SharePoint you want it to go to. But in our case, same folder name. So keep in mind this folder name, it's actually coming from up here when it's one of our arguments, folder name. And then the last thing is going to be output object, right? Which is going to be this. But keep in mind, we have to read the context of it as well. So we're going to call this read method that's part of this object. So it'll be the object output dot read. So this actually reads the data. Now it's able to grab all the context and everything, and that's what's going to get pushed. So by us calling this function that we call upload file, and then ultimately, again, it's passing everything into our SharePoint upload file class, which is over here. And this will know where to save it to, you know, ultimately pass the context and do all of that. I like to separate my stuff by functions, which is why I could have easily added this to here. But again, it gets a little bit more tricky because the purpose of this function is to modify the file. It wasn't designed to modify and upload a SharePoint. Nevertheless, though, that's just the way, you know, how I've been, the more that I have been trying to clean up my code and keep them separated and more manageable, you know, that's just kind of the way I have done it. But this is it, guys. This is it. Like, oh my bad, this is not it. So see, we're having this get files function. Well, we need to call this modify file function down here. So this is now where we're going to call this, it's going to be called modify files. Then we're going to pass in our file object and the argument. And this is it. As we pass this file context over to this function now is going to take it, you know, boom. Now we have it where we'll be able to read it. The reason why I'm reading this is to be able to get the sheet's name. So that's this is the only purpose why I'm doing this, to be able to get the sheet's name. That's it, no other reason. I get in the form of a list. Then this is actually going to read that file and put it into a data frame. That's what I'm doing here. Then of course I apply my changes, whatever it is that I'm doing, right? Whether it be modification, adding, whatever it is, you do it, you know, I did it here. Then once I finish with that, then now I'm going to create another empty object that's called output obj. It's going to be in memory object, but it's empty. Then that's where I start adding stuff to it, which I, you know, using the Excel writer. Then and then ultimately I start writing to it, which is to Excel. It starts writing to this object, and then, you know, then I'll save it, and then ultimately, yeah, that's it. I'm done. And then once I send this to my upload file function, which ultimately all it's doing is passing this information over to my SharePoint upload file, which is this function over here. It's able to save it under this name. This is a folder path where I want to save it to. Then it's going to read the context that we have in memory. So again, everything I'm doing here is all in memory. Downloading the file, it's in memory, modifying it, put it back in memory, and then it's sending it back to SharePoint. So now let's look at the file that we're going to be testing out. So if I look at my terminal, so if I look at my, you know what, you can't see it. There it goes. So it's Python, and I'm calling this file. My first argument here is in SharePoint. So let's take a look at it, right, in SharePoint. So if we go to SharePoint, we have data. So documents, data, 2022, cells, and then it's going to be this file right here. I know the name says CSV. It's not a CSV. As you could tell, it's an Excel file. So if I click on it, let's just take a look at it. This is what we're dealing with. Look at our tab. You know, we have our tab name here, and then we have our ID column, title, name, so on and so on. Right? Pretty straightforward. And then what should happen when we run the process, it should save a new file in here under, what name did we call it? Testing, modify Excel. This is a new name that it should show up if things work successfully. And it's going back. As you could tell, this is the second argument is when I'm specifying the specific file that I want to process. And then none is because if we look at argument 3, it's saying patterns. Well, I'm not looking for files in different patterns. Now, keep in mind, what I have here for my code is more designed to modify one file specifically and one tab specifically. There's a lot of different scenarios where it could be completely different. You know, maybe you want to modify a worksheet, a workbook that has mini sheets. And maybe the sheet that you want to modify is sheet number 10. That would be slightly different. Maybe you're dealing with a scenario where you have 50 files in SharePoint and you actually want to download all 50 and you want to be able to modify all 50. You know, all 50, you're doing something to it. You want to be able to modify and push all of those back. Again, that would actually be slightly different as well. So I'm trying to give at least the core, the basic concepts of it, but I am going to make some videos related to those two scenarios that we just talked about. So there will be videos coming out soon related to that. So now let's go ahead and test it out, guys. If I go ahead and run this code, cross fingers, hopefully no errors. Boom, no errors. Everything looks good. Let's come to SharePoint. If I hit refresh, boom, we got a new file. Testing, modify Excel file. So again, let's take a look at the original file. Original file, these are our columns, right, that we're dealing with. And remember, on the new one, let me take a snippet, just so we kind of compare the two, right? So if I take a snippet of this. So now, let's go ahead and take a look at the new one. So if we take a look at it, it has the same column names. This one slightly has a little format to it because kind of does it by default. It's bold, but you have ID, title, name, amount, sales amount. So this goes all the way to column J. Well, in our case, we have column K. The reason why we have a K column because this is what we call it, the new column, and we added some value here, right? So this kind of shows you how it does have the new column that we added, which again, in my case was a new column. In your case, it could be maybe you're adding these two values together and you're creating a new column. I mean, it could be whatever it is you're trying to do. Maybe you're moving stuff around, right? Maybe you're like saying, okay, well, I want to move this column, this reference column over in column B, and you want to shift everything over. Like the list goes on of what you could do with it, but it's just a quick example of kind of what I did. So again, guys, hopefully this helps, man. This was a request I got from a viewer. Again, guys, any kind of request you have, send it over. I do get a lot of requests. Keep in mind, do you get a lot of requests? But I am going to be putting effort every week to try to knock out a few of these requests that I get in. So it may take a little time, just depends. But nevertheless, do appreciate the support that y'all been giving me. Do appreciate all of that, guys. Hopefully this helps. Again, and if you have any questions, man, just go ahead and leave it in the comments or email me at contact@iamlou.net, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Again, guys, appreciate all the support and all the love I've been getting, and talk to y'all later. Peace.